Hey, welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Peterson. Oh wait, you know what? I think we did purple lights in the last video. I don't know. Maybe they should be red. Nah, not red. Maybe green? The green looks cool, but I think we do it a lot. How about some blue, maybe, huh? Yeah. What's up, blue? I'm gonna pick a color that we haven't done yet. Not as cool, but it's different. We're going orange. Looks like orange it is. Comment below what the color should be in the next video. As for right now, we're gonna get into something called the American War for Independence. Okay, I feel like I say this every video, but if you remember back to our last lesson, we'll link it up here in the cards. Great Britain had just passed what the colonists were referring to as the Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts, they just could not be tolerated, and this was a big deal to the colonists. They're also known in history as the Coercive Acts, and basically what it did was it shut down the poor in Massachusetts. It made them quarter British soldiers in their houses. There was the Quebec Act that further limited the expansion of the American frontier, and all of these different acts and laws were just piggybacked on top of all the other different taxes that Great Britain was levying on the American colonies, and the colonists did not like it. And why didn't they like it? Well, if you remember our phrase from, again, the last video, no taxation without representation. No taxation without representation. You can't be taxed if you're not going to let us have a seat in Parliament. And that's how many of the American colonists felt. They felt that they were paying the brunt of the war that Great Britain had fought against France in the French and Indian War. And you know what? They were right. They were paying the brunt of the war, because if you're the British, the whole reason you were over here fighting the French and the Indians in North America is because the colonists kept moving further and further west, creating conflict with the French and conflict with the Indians. Now let's look at what happens here in the American colonists after the Intolerable Acts are declared. Well, like we said, sentiment against the British was pretty high all throughout the 13 colonies. And in September of 1774, 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia couldn't make it. To be fair, Georgia has to travel the furthest to get there, so they just didn't send a delegate. But you have a who's who of American lawyers, American statesmen, American politicians, American generals like George Washington, and they all convene in Philadelphia at a place called Carpenter's Hall. You have what is referred to in American history as the First Continental Congress, and they're trying to figure out what to do with the deteriorating relationship between the American colonies and their mother country, Great Britain. Now, just like any group of people, you're going to have a range of different beliefs and different responses. You had your people that were ready to drop everything they were doing right there and go to war with Great Britain. You had a group of people that valued the trade and valued the protection that being a part of the British Empire offered, and so they didn't want to go to war at all. They wanted to fix this relationship. And then you had your people in the middle. But one thing that everyone could agree upon was the fact that they didn't like how they were being treated by the British. So whether they wanted to keep your status as a British citizen or whether you wanted to separate completely and start your own country here in the New World, didn't matter. You weren't cool with how the British were treating you. So despite the differences of the delegates at the First Continental Congress, they were able to agree on a few different ideas before they left and went back to their colonies. The first thing that they agreed on was that they were going to formally boycott all British goods. This included everything from rum to slaves. They weren't going to import anything that had to do with the British mercantile economy, which made it very hard on the Americans. A lot of them had to resort to creating things on their own, to making their own clothing, to making their own furniture, things that they kind of knew how to do already, but was part of the mercantile economy. And so that put a strain on the American population, but it was the first thing that they decided to do with the Continental Congress. They were all going to boycott British goods. The second thing that they all agreed to do was that they would beef up the militias in their colonies. They wanted to make sure that they had a standing force ready just in case it came to blows with Great Britain. The third thing they did was they all pledged to support one another if it actually did come to war. So this is really very similar to the Albany Plan that we looked at in the first episode of this chapter. The Albany Plan, they were uniting against their common enemy, the French and the Indian. Now here in 1774, they're having similar conversations about what to do against the mother country. And the final thing, and probably the most important thing that the First Continental Congress did, was that they drafted an official protest and sent it to King George III of England. And in this protest, all of the colonies still declared their loyalty to the British Crown. They still wanted to be British citizens. They just felt that as British citizens, they weren't being treated like full British citizens. And so these core values that they all had within themselves of liberty, of freedom, of equality, all these things are being tested by their government. And they remain loyal to that government, but they are addressing their grievances grievances with that government. Also, we see that the First Continental Congress laid the foundation to prepare for war if their government refused to honor these rights that they held near and dear. So the delegates disperse, they go back to the colonies, the committees of correspondence are going back and forth in towns in New England. You have people like Patrick Henry that are going back to their state legislatures and giving fiery, impassioned pleas for backing up what the First Continental Congress declared to do. In fact, he's famous for saying, "Give me liberty or give me death." He was ready to fight, and he wanted his fellow Virginians to be ready to fight as well. This is happening all over the colonies, and people begin to rise to meet the call to defend their homeland against oppression from their mother country. Now, if this was like a movie or a TV show or like a comic book, we would cut away and there'd be a little thing at the bottom of the screen that would say like, "Meanwhile in Boston." So you're just gonna have to imagine that we just dramatically panned to like the night sky of colonial Boston, and you're just gonna have to use your imagination here. Meanwhile, in Boston, you have a town that is occupied by British soldiers. Remember, the Boston Port Bill and the Navigation and Trade Acts basically shut down all trade in and out of Boston. And so Boston is pretty much on lockdown. And lots of your revolutionary leaders, men like Samuel Adams, men like John Hancock, actually leave Boston to go out into the countryside. And in the countryside outside of Boston is where you have probably your most radical and your most fervent American patriots that are ready to take up arms against the British if it comes to it. One such group is a group of young men that were ready to fight in a moment's notice. These are known in history as the Minutemen, and it's the Minutemen that are actually going to be involved in the first conflict here in what is known as the Revolutionary War, the American War for Independence, the American Revolution, whatever you want to call it. The Minutemen were down for it, and they'll come up here pretty shortly. But also outside of Boston, you see lots of different countryside farmers and people living in the towns there. They begin to stockpile weapons and ammunition, and they're ready just in case the British troops move out from Boston and begin to try to occupy even more land in the name of protection and safety. Well, the British inside of Boston become privy to this information of what's happening outside the city limits. And so British General Thomas Gage deploys 800 troops to go to the countryside town of Concord outside of Boston, Massachusetts, with the goal of seizing a Patriot stockpile of arms that they've heard exists. So under the cover of nightfall, these British troops, the regulars or the Redcoats as they're known, begin to march out of Boston and into the Massachusetts countryside. Also, Thomas Gage gives a standing order to arrest John Hancock and Samuel Adams if they come across them. Now, the British, they thought they were pretty sneaky getting out of Boston under the cover of nightfall. However, there were three men and several others, but the three most famous ones are Samuel Prescott, William Dawes, and Paul Revere. And these three guys go on a midnight ride all throughout the Massachusetts countryside, telling all these different smaller towns that the British are coming, or the regulars are coming, or the Redcoats are coming, or whatever version of it you've heard. All right, it's true. They go out into the countryside and they tell them, hey, we need to get ready for some conflict because the British are marching on Concord. Now, the British are marching there to seize weapons. They have no intent to actually fight anyone, but they're soldiers, so they're ready if that happens. The American patriots don't want their weapons taken from them, so they are ready to stand up and defy these British troops. They're also not necessarily looking for a battle, though, because 800 troops versus a handful of Minutemen, the odds are not in favor of the Minutemen. However, thanks to men like Westcott, Dawes, Revere, the Minutemen are ready, they assemble, and the British come to the town of Lexington. And several Minutemen had taken up a position in the Lexington town green, not necessarily in the path of the British soldiers, but they were there in defiance, telling them that they were not okay with the British coming into the town and looking to take weapons from American and British citizens. Well, these two forces basically square off. They're in a standoff. The British general there tells the Americans to stand down and lay down their weapons, and at that point is when you hear it. I don't have like a gun sound effects. We're just gonna have to imagine. Bang. One shot. It's known in history as the shot heard around the world because it was a tiny group of American colonists picking a fight with the world's strongest empire at that time. We still don't really know who fired that first shot. It could have been a trigger-happy colonist. It could have been an overly anxious British regular. No matter what happened, though, that one shot was followed by several volleys. And in the end of it, at least 8 Americans lay dead in the Lexington town green, and several British had been wounded as well. The Patriots disperse. They head into the woods. They head to the city of Concord, which is where the British were eventually marching to. They're joined there by several other Minutemen and members of the Massachusetts militia, and they're ready to stand off against the British. The British get to Concord. They also engage in another round of fighting with several militia members there. They aren't able to find the stockpile of weapons that were confirmed to be there because we got them. We took them. Or there wasn't one to begin with. But either way, the British get there, there's nothing there. They turn around, they march back towards Boston. But the whole way back to Boston, the whole way back to safety, the British are being harassed and peppered with shots from the woods by the Minutemen and the Massachusetts militia that are engaging in, that's right, you guessed it, guerrilla warfare. And the British aren't ready for this, so they're basically retreating. They're running from this small group of American colonists. But what you have here is really a small group of American colonists standing up against the largest empire in the world, and news of that travels fast. And it rallies the cause for American independence all throughout the colonies. The British have attacked us. They're oppressing us now to the point of physical harm and death. We need to do something about it. And that's what gets us the American War for Independence. You just learned about the first battle. So in our next video, we're going to see how this one battle turns into a huge conflict that eventually leads to the United States of America as we know it today. Thanks for hanging out with us. We'll see you next time. These are all the colors we got. Whoa. Strobe. Might need to put a little warning at the beginning of this video. People are prone to seizures. Anyways, like and subscribe.